He lost a leg serving his country. Now Darius Boone, a retired black Navy SEAL, is dragged into court over a petty charge, and the moment he steps in, a white cop kicks him down in front of everyone. But no one in that courtroom realizes Darius isn't just anyone. And when the truth surfaces, the entire room will freeze. What happens when the man they try to humiliate is the one holding the final say? Like, share, and subscribe if this story moves you. Now let's walk into that courtroom with Darius. You could hear it before you saw him, the steady thump of a prosthetic foot against the marble tile. Each step firm, measured like he'd rehearsed the weight of silence. Darius Boone entered the Riverdale County Courthouse without ceremony. No family, no escort, no lawyer beside him. Just him, a plain navy coat, a titanium leg, and the kind of posture that told you he'd carried more weight than most men would ever understand. He walked past the clerk's desk, past a hallway still echoing with half-finished cases, and into courtroom 2B, where his name was written in black ink across a manila folder labeled Trespassing, Class C, Misdemeanor. But here's what that folder didn't say. 3 days earlier, Darius had kicked in the back door of a house on Ashmont Street, not to steal, not to squat, but to save. Inside that house lay Bobby Mendez, a paralyzed Gulf War vet who'd suffered a massive stroke and hadn't been heard from in days. Darius had found him barely conscious, dehydrated, surrounded by flies. He made the 911 call himself. But to the Riverdale PD, it was breaking and entering. No one cared that he saved a life. The report was cleaner without the context. Inside the courtroom, things felt colder than the November wind. The walls were pale green, the benches scarred, and the heater clicked every few seconds like it was nervous to be there. At the far end sat Judge Lynette Granger, a woman in her 50s with a face like carved marble, composed, unreadable, and from the look of it, uninterested. And just behind Darius stood Officer Luke Reddick. White mid-40s posture like a man who thought he owned the place. He didn't say much when he escorted Darius in, just leaned slightly and said in a voice quiet but sharp, "Funny seeing you here again. Not friendly, not curious, something colder." The kind of statement loaded with history. Darius didn't respond. He didn't blink. He just gave him a glance. The kind of glance that knows the past is still walking the room with you. Sitting in the back row was Eli Jameson, a 27-year-old local reporter who'd only dropped by hoping to catch a quiet docket. He didn't expect much from a trespassing case, but from the moment Boone walked in, Eli noticed something strange. It was the silence. Not just from Darius, but from the courtroom itself. The way the prosecutor didn't look up. The way the bailiff didn't announce the charge with any conviction. The way the judge skimmed the file like it was already beneath her attention. There was a weight here. Attention. And Eli, to his credit, leaned forward. Something about this felt wrong. Judge Granger didn't lift her eyes as she spoke. "Mr. Boone, you've been charged with criminal trespass. You were found inside a condemned home without permission. Do you understand the charge against you?" Darius nodded slowly. "I do. Do you have legal counsel?" "No, ma'am. Would you like the court to appoint one?" He hesitated for a second. "No, thank you." "Then how do you plead?" Darius looked around the courtroom once. Just once. No one looking back at him. No one seemed to care that a man who'd worn the flag on his chest was now standing on a titanium leg, answering for the crime of caring too much. "I plead guilty," he said. Gasps didn't follow. No one stood up. It was like the moment passed through the room without touching it. Granger nodded without emotion. Noted. Eli blinked. This made no sense. The man didn't even try to explain, didn't fight, didn't defend. He jotted notes as fast as his hand could move but kept glancing up at Darius. There was a heaviness in that man's silence that didn't feel like defeat. It felt deliberate. The prosecutor, a young guy with cufflinks and a clipboard, muttered something about repeat offenders and setting an example. He didn't bother making eye contact with Darius once. Eli could feel it now. The room had decided this man was just another case, a closed file. A black man in a courtroom with no one to speak for him. Simple, convenient. But then, just as Judge Granger prepared to move on, Eli saw it. Darius turned slightly and looked back at Officer Reddick. It wasn't rage, it wasn't fear, it was something else entirely. Disappointment. Not the kind that comes from being mistreated, the kind that comes from knowing you once carried someone out of fire, and now they'd rather pretend you never did. And that's when Eli leaned back slowly in his seat and whispered to himself, "This isn't about trespassing. Not at all." Because in that one look he knew, there was a story here, one that hadn't made it into the manila folder, and the truth hadn't even entered the courtroom yet. The morning light had shifted in the courtroom. It streamed through the tall windows in slanted stripes, hitting the floor in quiet patterns. But the air, it felt sharp, like something was waiting to snap. Darius Boone stood up slowly as the judge called for a brief recess. His hand rested lightly on the bench beside him for balance. He didn't ask for help. He never did. Across the room, Officer Luke Reddick leaned against the wall, arms crossed, lips curled in a smirk he wasn't trying to hide. His voice cut across the quiet space like a dull blade. "You always made excuses." The words didn't land like a jab. They dropped like poison. Eli Jameson looked up from his notepad, eyes narrowing. That wasn't courtroom talk. That was personal. Darius didn't turn. He simply took a step forward, slow and even, his titanium leg clicking softly beneath his slacks. Then came the moment no one expected. In one sudden motion, Reddick pushed off the wall, stepped forward, and without warning, swung his boot directly into Darius's prosthetic leg. The sound echoed through the room. A hard, hollow crack, metal on metal, followed by silence. Darius lost his balance. His body twisted and he fell hard, shoulder hitting the bench elbow, slamming into the floor. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't cinematic, it was brutal. And no one moved, not the prosecutor, not the judge, not even the bailiff. One man in the corner chuckled a short, uncomfortable laugh that quickly died in his throat. Someone else whispered Jesus but didn't get up. No one helped him. Eli stood. He hadn't planned to. His legs just moved. Camera already in hand, he snapped 3 shots in rapid fire. Darius on the ground, Reddick standing over him, and the judge looking away. Reddick took a step back casually. No apology, no reaction. Just that same smug expression like he'd dropped a bag of trash, not a human being. Darius lay still for a beat, then 2. Then, with effort, he rolled to his side and pushed himself upright, one hand on the bench, the other braced against his knee. He didn't look at Reddick. He didn't look at the judge. He looked straight ahead and said, calm and low, so low the room had to lean in to hear it, "You didn't just kick me. You kicked every man I carried back from the battlefield." The room stayed quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that respected dignity. It was the kind that exposed shame. The shame of watching something terrible happen and doing nothing. Eli's pulse hammered in his neck. He took a few more shots, hands trembling. This wasn't just news anymore. It was a moment, a fault line. He scanned the room, searching for someone, anyone who looked disturbed by what just happened. The bailiff kept his head down. The prosecutor tapped on his phone. Judge Granger adjusted her robe and cleared her throat. Business as usual. Eli couldn't believe it. Here was a man, a veteran, just assaulted in open court, and no one even wrote it down. No one asked if he was okay. No one told Reddick to stand down. No one even paused the hearing. He leaned toward the old court clerk near the back, a black man with silver hair and a deeply lined face, who'd been watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. Eli whispered, "Does that guy Reddick do this kind of thing often?" The clerk didn't answer right away. He exhaled, rubbed his knuckles, then said under his breath, "Look up. Seal. 11. You'll understand." Eli blinked. Seal 11. The man just nodded. Start there, and keep your head on straight. He didn't say anything else. But Eli didn't need more. That name, Seal 11, already rang like a bell in his memory. A unit. He couldn't place it exactly, but it triggered something he'd read about once. Something intense, classified, buried. Eli sat back down, fingers flying over his phone. He wasn't a war correspondent, but he knew how to dig, and whatever connection existed between Reddick and Boone, it didn't start here, and it sure as hell didn't end with a cheap shot in a courtroom. Meanwhile, Darius had retaken his seat. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his leg, and sat without a word. His face didn't show pain, or humiliation, just gravity. He looked like a man who'd been hurt by worse things than boots. But Eli couldn't shake it. That fall, that silence, that sentence. You didn't just kick me. You kicked every man I carried back from the battlefield. It wasn't just a line. It was a verdict. And the courtroom wasn't ready for it. The courtroom resumed like nothing had happened. No mention of the kick, no medical break, just the judge tapping her gavel, bored and stiff, calling the next motion. But something had changed. You could feel it in the way the air held its breath around Darius Boone. He sat straighter now, not in defiance, but like a man who'd survived worse storms and was simply waiting this one out. When a court officer asked if he needed medical attention, Darius shook his head once. Pains never scared me. It wasn't bravado. It was just a fact, stated like the weather. Eli Jameson, still rattled from what he'd witnessed, slid over quietly during the recess. He sat one row behind Darius, leaned forward, and whispered like someone not sure he had the right. Why didn't you react? Darius didn't turn around, didn't flinch, just sat with his hands folded like a statue carved out of something heavy and real. Then he said low and level, I've reacted before. Someone died. And just like that, the whole courtroom seemed to shift again, not from sound, but from memory. It was in Kunar Province, 2007. A hot zone. A bad call. Darius had been leading a SEAL team extraction. They were under fire. Bullets slicing the dirt like razors. His comms were jammed, and he couldn't see the full terrain. Still, rage clouded his better judgment. An IED had taken out a Humvee minutes earlier. One of his men, Walker, was trapped behind it, screaming through the radio. Darius had shouted, barked into the static, "Go get him!" He meant it like a command, but it came from something raw anger. One of the younger guys, Mendez, sprinted out without cover. A sniper took him down in 3 seconds, neck shot, gone before he hit the dirt. Walker survived. Mendez didn't. And that day, something inside Darius shut down, not in fear, but in discipline. He learned the cost of volume, of rage, of reacting. He'd been a warrior all his life, but that day he decided to become a wall. Still, solid, a shield others could lean on, not bleed from. Back in the present, Eli didn't press further. He just sat there looking at Darius's back, realizing he wasn't silent because he was weak. He was silent because he had learned what his voice could break. Just then, the courtroom doors opened again. 2 officers dragged in a young black man, maybe 19. Wrists cuffed, lips split. 1 shoe missing. His name wasn't called, but his presence shouted plenty. They shoved him onto a bench outside the next courtroom, the metal cuffs rattling against the wood. Darius turned his head just a little. His eyes locked on the kid. The boy looked up for half a second, enough time to recognize a kind of reflection. And then Darius looked away. Not because he couldn't bear it, but because he could. He whispered not to anyone in particular, just into the air that hung around his seat. If I scream, he'll wear my noise someday. Eli froze. It was the kind of line that didn't need explaining. It just sank. Darius wasn't silent because the system demanded it. He was silent because he refused to pass the cost of his fire down to the next generation. He had learned to swallow the heat so no one else had to burn for it. In that moment, Eli didn't see a broken man. He saw a soldier holding the weight of every voice he never raised, and every life it might have shattered. No one else in that room noticed the shift. But Eli did. And deep inside, so did the young man in cuffs. Because for just a second, the noise stopped. And all that was left was one man's quiet stronger than any shout in the room. The words haunted Eli all night. "Look up Seal 11. You'll understand." It had come from the old courthouse janitor, a man with eyes too quiet to be ordinary. Eli had caught the tip like a spark, and by midnight it had turned into a wildfire in his chest. So he started digging. The public records were sparse, too clean, too edited. But Eli had learned early in journalism school that truth rarely lives in official documents. It lives in what's missing from them. Then he found a forgotten press clipping from 2008. No headlines, just a blurry photo. A SEAL unit stepping out of a chopper under firelight. Caption: SEAL Team 11 returns from Kunar. At the center of it was a younger Darius Boone face covered in dust, body turned like a wall between his men and the chaos behind them. Eli's breath hitched. Under the image, a small note: Boone declined the Medal of Honor following the Kunar incident, citing civilian casualties and failed intel. Declined. Who the hell declines the Medal of Honor? It wasn't shame. That was clear. It was accountability. Darius had survived a mission that killed 4 of his men and left 12 civilians dead due to a botched intel drop from higher command. He had carried every wounded soldier back by hand, then refused to be decorated for it. That wasn't just honor. That was a man drawing a line in blood. Eli dug deeper. Late at night in forums where veterans whispered what official records buried. And that's when he found Reddick's name, Luke Reddick, listed once on an early SEAL roster in 2006, then vanished. No commendations, no promotions, no mention at all after a single training incident. A redacted training file until someone in a vet forum sent Eli a blurred scan and a line of chat. "You didn't get this from me. Reddick nearly got a man killed during an op sim. Panic fire. Boone covered for him, but pushed for discharge." Eli blinked. Darius Boone had protected Luke Reddick. Even after the kid nearly shot a teammate in a drill, Darius had cleaned up the mess. Didn't report it to upper command in full. Didn't shame the unit. He carried it alone. But still, he recommended Reddick's removal from SEAL eligibility. Said the kid wasn't mission-minded, and the system, they didn't reprimand Reddick. They just shifted him sideways. From SEAL trainee to regular military police, then on to local enforcement, and now, Reddick wore a badge, and Darius wore handcuffs. Eli stared at the screen. The pieces no longer felt like a mystery. They felt like a knife slowly unsheathing itself. He protected the man who kicked him. Eli said it out loud just to hear the madness of it. It wasn't a simple feud, wasn't about ego or rank. It was betrayal. Deep, human betrayal. One man had saved another's future, and that man had turned around and kicked him into the floor of a courtroom. Not because Darius had wronged him, but because his very existence was a reminder of who Reddick used to be and who he could never become. Reddick had failed the Brotherhood, failed the Standard, and Darius had held that truth in silence for almost 2 decades. Now the man he once protected was using that silence as a weapon against him. The next morning, Eli showed up at the courthouse early. His hands trembled as he gripped the file printouts. Darius sat alone in the hallway, one leg stretched stiff, the other foot flat on the floor like an anchor. He looked ahead like he was watching something no one else could see. Eli stood there, unsure how to begin. He finally asked, voice barely audible, "Why didn't you tell anyone what Reddick did?" Darius didn't turn. He just said, "Some debts. I thought I could carry quiet." Then after a pause, "But silence. don't mean it didn't hurt. Eli sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Because what do you say when someone chooses dignity over revenge? When a man's restraint becomes the very thing others exploit. Inside that courtroom, Reddick sat at the prosecution table smug and stiff. He had no idea what Eli now knew, what the world was about to find out. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones people scream from rooftops. They're the ones buried in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to unearth the truth. At 6:47 a.m., Eli Jamison clicked publish. The headline was short-pointed and heavy. He lost his leg for this country, then lost his dignity in its courtroom. Beneath it, a still frame, blurry but unmistakable. Darius Boone, mid-fall. His titanium leg twisted at a cruel angle, the courtroom behind him frozen. Standing nearby, Officer Luke Reddick, unmoved. No shock, no regret, just cold authority. Eli sat back in the quiet hum of the courthouse press room. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had just unleashed. He hadn't written the article like a reporter. He'd written it like someone who had witnessed something sacred, being spit on. And by noon, it was everywhere. The first ripple came from the Veterans of Valor Network, reposting the story with the caption, "This man deserves justice, not humiliation." Then came the storm. On TikTok, a Navy vet read the article aloud in full uniform, pausing only to wipe a tear. On Twitter, the hashtag #HonorBoone began trending within hours. Cable news panels flashed side-by-side images, one of Darius, in full gear, with medals on his chest, and one of him lying on the courtroom floor, humiliated and alone. By 1 p.m., the National Veterans Alliance released a statement. "We are appalled by the treatment of Darius Boone, a decorated SEAL and true patriot. We demand a federal inquiry into the conduct of Officer Reddick and the presiding court." At 3:42 p.m., a clip surfaced, a silent phone video of the exact moment Officer Reddick kicked Darius's prosthetic leg. There was no voiceover, no background music, just the sound of a hard boot hitting metal and the dull thud of a hero falling. By 5:00 p.m., the front steps of Riverdale Courthouse looked like a military reunion. Veterans from 3 wars stood shoulder to shoulder. Some wore full dress uniform. Others came in worn-out denim with faded unit patches. They held signs, "Shame on this court. He fought for us. Now we fight for him. Honor isn't optional." An elderly black woman held a photo of Darius at age 22, smiling with his arm around a teammate. "I saw that boy leave for Iraq," she whispered to a local reporter. "I never thought I'd see him fall like that. Not here. Not at home." Inside the courthouse, Darius said nothing. He sat quietly in the hallway watching the chaos unfold on a TV across the wall. His photo was now the background on every news network. Anchors debated his silence. Pundits speculated his next move. When a young camera crew approached him, he waved them off without words. Eli arrived a few minutes later, holding a printout of the article. "I didn't expect this kind of reaction," he admitted. "It's bigger than I thought." Darius didn't look at the printout. He just said quietly, "It was never about just me." Eli nodded. "You could speak now. Everyone's listening." But Darius shook his head. "They're not listening." "Not yet," he said. "They're still angry, still yelling. Let it settle." Then he looked Eli in the eye. "When you scream, people forget the sound. But when you whisper something true, it stays." By sundown, the Department of Defense issued an official statement. The department is aware of the incident involving former SEAL Darius Boone. A preliminary investigation has been launched. The video footage is under review. Officer Reddick was quietly placed on administrative leave, no public apology, no admission of wrongdoing. But the silence spoke volumes. Even more powerful was who hadn't spoken: Darius himself. Later that evening, as candles flickered on the courthouse steps, a young man in a Marine's jacket took the microphone. His name was Marcus. He'd served in Afghanistan. He stood for a long moment silent before saying, I've been shot twice. Spent a year learning how to walk again, but the deepest wound I've ever felt came yesterday. Watching a man who once saved lives being treated like a criminal. He paused. The leg he lost didn't make him weak. The silence he chose after being kicked, that made him strong. The next morning, pressure mounted. Congressional representatives from both parties called for transparency. The Veterans Affairs Oversight Committee demanded transcripts and footage from the courtroom. Petitions circulated with over 300,000 signatures demanding Officer Reddick's dismissal and the reinstatement of Darius's honor. Still, Darius remained silent. Eli posted again, just once. No image, no caption, just black text on a white background. Let silence scream louder than speeches. It was shared over 1.8 million times. But Darius never reposted it. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, the country was shouting what he never had to say. And this time, they were listening. The courtroom had never been this full. Every pew was packed. Veterans in uniform stood along the walls. Reporters lined the back cameras, clicking before the gavel even dropped. A soft murmur filled the air, thick with anticipation. This wasn't just a retrial. It felt like a reckoning. Judge Lynette Granger sat with her hands folded, eyes scanning the crowd like someone who no longer assumed control but searched for understanding. Darius Boone sat in the same seat posture, straight face, unreadable. His leg brace gleamed under the fluorescent light, but his silence still held the most weight in the room. Officer Luke Reddick was brought in under escort jaw, tight gaze defiant. He didn't look at Darius. Not once. The clerk called the case. All rise for the matter of State versus Darius Boone, reopened on grounds of new evidence and public interest. Granger didn't rise. She simply nodded. Proceed. The prosecution tried to paint it quickly, just a case of an overzealous veteran stepping out of line. Reddick's lawyer spoke first. My client acted under stress in a tense environment. He regrets his reaction but reminds the court officers are human too. Reddick cleared his throat, leaned toward the microphone. There was no malice. Just pressure. I was managing security in a high-profile case. Boone was slow, non-compliant. I didn't know his history at the time. Gasps rippled through the room. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone had read the reports. Darius hadn't moved. Now he raised his hand just slightly. Granger looked at him. You may speak, Mr. Boone. He stood slowly, then faced the room, not Reddick. His voice was calm, but his words pressed into the walls like a slow rising wave. Not every uniform is earned in peace. But every pain deserves respect. He looked at Granger not to sway her, but to invite her to see. I was carrying someone when I lost my leg, a young man who didn't make it home. I've carried that pain longer than the prosthetic. A beat of silence. But that pain never gave me permission to be cruel. He sat down again. That was all he said. But no one moved for nearly a minute. Granger cleared her throat and requested the sealed military records that had recently surfaced. A clerk handed her a thick folder frayed at the corners. She opened it gently. One by one, she pulled out commendation letters, incident reports, field evaluations. Darius Boone, SEAL Team 11, Silver Star, rescue mission classified, wounded in Kandahar, carried 2 men out under mortar fire. Refused Medal of Honor, requested it go instead to a teammate who died in the same mission. Granger turned a page and stopped. There, tucked between 2 stapled reports, was a handwritten letter. She unfolded it slowly. It was penned in blue ink on yellowing paper. The handwriting was neat, almost hesitant. Dear Mr. Boone, you don't know me, but my son, Private Mason Ray, wrote about you in his last letter. He said you dragged him from a collapsed building even after you were already hit. He didn't survive, but I needed to thank you anyway, because someone told me he wasn't alone when he died, and that someone was you. God bless you. Rachel Ray. Granger lowered the paper. Her hands trembled slightly. No one breathed. For the first time in her long career, Judge Granger looked like someone who had stopped judging and started reckoning. She leaned back in her chair, eyes still on the letter. Then she spoke not to the lawyers, not to the press, but to the room itself. I've presided over this bench for 17 years. I've read thousands of records, but I've never read one that made me ashamed to have ignored it before. She turned to Reddick. I see now that what happened in this room wasn't just an error of judgment. It was a failure of character. Reddick opened his mouth to protest, but Granger cut him off. You don't get to speak now. You had your turn. Then she turned to Darius, this time not with the cool distance of a judge, but with the weight of someone confronting truth. Perhaps this courtroom needed to be judged first. A murmur rose in the room. The cameras zoomed in. Darius didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just blinked once slow, like someone who had waited a long time to be seen but never demanded it. Granger turned back to the bench. She gavelled the room once soft and firm. This hearing is not over, but its direction has changed. Outside, as the crowd spilled into the courthouse lawn, the words, "Perhaps this courtroom needed to be judged," first, flashed across news tickers nationwide. It was the beginning of something. Not redemption. Not yet. But recognition. And for men like Darius Boone, that was more than enough to finally stand tall, even on one leg. The courtroom buzzed with whispers before the judge arrived, but as the next session began, a hush settled over the crowd like a blanket of snow. Everyone knew this wasn't just another hearing anymore. Cameras clicked. Reporters adjusted their mics. The whole country was watching, but none of them expected what came next. As Darius sat silently at the defense table, still composed, unmoved, a slow, creaking sound echoed through the courtroom doors. And then they appeared. 6 men. Former Navy SEALs, each one with a face weathered by time and eyes sharp from things most people could never understand. They wore their dress uniforms, some faded, some crisp, but all walked in sync boots, striking the floor with steady, undeniable rhythm. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. They marched down the aisle and took their place directly behind Darius. Not beside. Behind. Like a wall. The room stiffened. Even Judge Granger froze for a moment. Then one of them stepped forward. He was older, early 60s maybe, with silver hair and a chest full of medals. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked straight at Reddick and said in a calm, low voice, "You kicked him alone. Now face us together. No shouting, no anger, just truth." Reddick's eyes darted to the floor. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His hands fidgeted under the table. And for the first time since the case began, his posture cracked. The uniform he wore no longer looked like a badge of power. It looked like a borrowed shield. Darius didn't turn around. He didn't need to. His silence, once misread as weakness, now radiated something else entirely. Eli stood by the wall, notebook in hand. But he didn't write right away. He watched. He watched the tension ripple through the room like an aftershock. Watched how people straightened in their seats. Watched how Reddick, once smug and sure, now looked like a child caught in a lie too big to fix. And then Eli finally scribbled a line that he would later say changed his entire understanding of justice. For once, justice didn't wear a robe. It wore scars and medals. Granger cleared her throat, but the weight of the moment made even her gavel hesitate. She looked down at her bench and then at Darius and then at the men behind him, men who weren't here for revenge, but for respect. She exhaled, then finally spoke. Given the new evidence testimonies submitted and circumstances surrounding this case, this court rules to continue investigation under full review. The trial will not proceed until proper conduct standards are reevaluated. There was no applause. No gasps, only stillness. Even that felt louder than words. Reddick remained seated, staring down at his folded hands. One of his fingers tapped a slow, nervous rhythm against the table. His eyes flickered to the SEALs again, particularly the man who'd spoken. Recognition passed across his face, faint but real. He knew him, and it wasn't just about Darius anymore. It was about everything he pretended to forget. As the room began to empty, the seals didn't move. They stood their ground, letting the moment settle like dust on the courtroom floor. One finally leaned down toward Darius and whispered something only he could hear. Darius gave a single nod, slow, almost reluctant. Eli followed him out steps behind, and this time the crowd parted for Darius without a word. Outside in the long hallway between the court and the world, Eli finally asked, "Was that planned? The men, did you call them?" Darius paused, looked ahead, and answered quietly. They weren't summoned. They remembered. Eli scribbled that too. But more than the quote, what stayed with him was the look in Darius's eyes, tired but clear. Heavy with memory but never bitter. In the days that followed that courtroom image, Darius, seated with 6 warriors behind him, would become iconic. It was replayed on news cycles, captured in headlines, and painted onto murals across veteran centers. Some called it a reckoning, others redemption. But to those who truly understood, it wasn't about revenge. It was a reminder. A reminder that silence isn't surrender, that dignity isn't loud, and that sometimes the strongest message is standing shoulder to shoulder without saying a word. The news didn't break with a bang. It came quietly, almost respectfully, like the man himself. Early morning, before the courthouse even opened its doors again, the Department of Defense released a brief but seismic statement. Effective immediately retired SEAL Commander Darius Boone has accepted appointment as Director of State Ethics and Military Conduct Oversight. No cameras, no stage, no speech, just a single sentence that shifted the ground beneath the courtroom. Eli read the release 3 times, then once more just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. He stared at the words like they were rewriting the very narrative of power. Darius Boone, once handcuffed and humiliated, was now in charge of the system that let it happen. It wasn't just a promotion, it was a reckoning. When Darius arrived back at the courthouse later that day, he wore no uniform, no medals, just a charcoal suit, clean shave, and the same quiet step, titanium foot tapping gently with each stride. This time, no officer barked at him. No guard looked him over twice. The building had changed. Or maybe it finally saw him clearly. Judge Granger met him just outside the courtroom doors. She extended her hand, but not like last time, not from behind the bench. This wasn't a gesture from a judge to a former defendant. This was different. She looked into his eyes and said, almost like a confession, "The system should have listened to you a long time ago." Darius didn't respond right away. He looked down at her hand, then back at her, and slowly shook it. "Then, let's make sure it starts now," he said. Inside, a final procedural hearing began, more formal than dramatic. The court had already moved to a full review, and public pressure ensured accountability would follow. But this moment was less about legality and more about presence. Darius sat, not at the defendant's bench this time, but in the front row reserved for oversight observers. Reddick sat at the far end of the courtroom, arms folded, jaw tight. The man who once barked orders at Darius now couldn't even hold his gaze. During a short recess, Darius stood, walked slowly toward him, and stopped just a few feet away. The room quieted. Even the bailiff stepped aside. Darius didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked at Reddick and said, "You feared my silence. Now you'll have to answer to it." Reddick didn't move. His face twitched, whether from regret, pride, or fear, no one could tell. But he didn't reply. That silence belonged to Darius now. Eli, tucked in the back of the courtroom, scribbled fast. But more than the quote, he focused on the power shift, not in the law books, not in the camera angles, but in posture, tone, and how the air itself felt different with Darius in the room. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was responsibility. After court adjourned, Granger approached Darius again, this time without a crowd watching. She smiled a soft, uncertain smile and said, "You remember me?" Darius looked at her for a long second, then nodded. You were a clerk in '92. Nervous. You dropped your pen 4 times that day. Granger let out a breathy laugh. You remembered that. Darius shrugged gently. I remember everyone who tried to do the right thing, even when they were still learning how. She lowered her gaze, moved to speak again, but paused. There was nothing more to say. Some truths don't need full circles, just open doors. Darius stepped outside into the open light where a few members of the press waited. Microphones reached for him, questions hovered, but he raised a single hand not to silence them, but to signal stillness. Then, in a low, steady voice, he said, I'm not here to punish. I'm here to protect what the uniform meant before men like Reddick wore it like armor, not honor. The system doesn't need noise. It needs direction. And I intend to give it just that. And with that, he walked off. No escort, no applause. Just the sound of his steps echoing through a building that once failed him. The courtroom had gone quiet, but the country had not. The day after Darius Boone stepped into his new role, the headlines changed. Not just because a war hero had been humiliated, but because people finally saw how deep the cracks ran. And this time, they didn't look away. Officer Luke Reddick was suspended by noon. No press release, no defense statement. Just a one-line notice pinned to the courthouse bulletin. Effective immediately, Officer Reddick is relieved of all duties pending internal investigation. But that was only the beginning. The Department of the Interior announced a full-scale review of Reddick's last 8 years of service. Every stop, every complaint, every report that had once been buried under paperwork or conveniently mislabeled as insufficient evidence, all of it was now under scrutiny. And what they found cracked the air like a bullet in silence. Patterns of targeting black veterans during routine stops. Body cam footage with mysteriously missing minutes. Complaint letters written by grieving mothers, unopened in dusty files. 8 years. Too many names. Eli Jameson sat in a small corner of the newsroom flipping through one case after another. Some names he recognized, others he had never heard before, but they all shared one thing in common: they had been quiet, or made to be. Now they were loud. Eli's next article didn't begin with a quote. It began with a list, name after name, case after case, and one line beneath them all. It took one leg to expose the rot in a system standing on 2. The article went viral within hours, and it made its way back to Riverdale Courthouse, straight into Judge Lynette Granger's hands. She didn't cry. She didn't look shocked. She just read slowly, like each line was a mirror. Then in the next morning's hearing, she stood from the bench before the proceedings even began. The room stilled. She looked around, not at Darius, not even at Reddick, but at every silent official, every clerk, every bailiff who had once watched and said nothing. And she said, "From today forward, silence will no longer be a defense. It will be counted as evidence." A quiet murmur swept through the gallery, then stillness again. For the first time in her career, Granger stepped down from the bench and walked to the center of the room. I used to believe justice was about balance, but I've learned it's also about courage, and sometimes unlearning the silence we were trained to keep. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. Reddick, seated near the back now, didn't speak. His posture slouched. For the first time, there was no defiance in his eyes, no smirk, just the hollow look of a man who realized the tide had turned and it wasn't turning back. Outside protest signs began to fill the streets, but they weren't angry slogans or chants of destruction. They were photos of veterans, of brothers, of daughters, of black men and women in uniform with captions like, "Served with honor, judged without it. You can't erase a war record with a courtroom whisper." Eli stood among them that evening, notebook tucked under one arm. But for once he didn't take notes. He just listened. A teenage boy stood next to him holding up a poster of Darius Boone. "You know him?" the kid asked. Eli smiled, eyes soft. "I watched him change the entire courtroom. and he never raised his voice. The boy nodded slowly, then added, "Guess that's what real strength looks like." Back inside, Darius sat alone in the oversight chamber. A file lay open before him, not Reddick's, not Granger's, but his own. It was time to close it, to stop being the subject of the report, and start being the author of change. When asked later if he felt vindicated, Darius said simply, "It's not about winning. It's about making sure no one else has to lose like that again." Eli's last note of the day was short. No quotes, no stats, just 7 words. Justice walked in. Not roaring, but undeniable. And this time the system had no choice but to listen. The morning sun filtered gently through the wide windows of the rehabilitation center, casting soft gold across the mats and metal railings. In the center of the room, 2 shadows moved slowly, one steady, one uncertain. Darius Boone stood beside a young man no older than 21. The kid gripped the parallel bars tight, sweat lining his brow. His left pant leg was rolled up, exposing a newly fitted prosthetic limb. His right leg trembled under the pressure of balance. "You're not walking for speed," Darius said softly. "You're walking to reclaim ground that pain tried to take." The young man nodded, jaw tight. Every step he took made the railings rattle. But Darius didn't flinch. He moved in rhythm, not as an instructor barking orders, but as a presence, firm, patient, immovable. That kid. He wasn't just any recruit. He was the same young black man Darius had seen being shoved into a courtroom weeks earlier. Back then, his eyes had been downcast, his spirit bruised before a verdict was even spoken. But now, he looked up. Now, he called Darius sir. "I didn't think I'd make it through," the boy whispered during a break. "They made me feel like I was nothing." Darius looked him dead in the eye and replied, "Then you already made it. Because the moment they try to strip you down and you're still standing even wobbly, that's something they can't take." The boy blinked hard and gave a shaky nod. Outside, Eli Jameson approached the center holding a manila envelope under his arm. His usual energy had mellowed into something softer since the last trial, not beaten down, but humbled, changed. He knocked gently and was waved in by a nurse. When he stepped into the room and saw Darius with the young soldier, Eli paused at the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. But Darius spotted him and offered a small wave, just 2 fingers raised. "Didn't expect you out of the courtroom," Darius said with a half smile. "I didn't expect to see you back on duty," Eli replied, holding out the envelope. "Thought you might want to see the final print version. They're calling it The Veteran Who Chose Silence." Darius took the article, held it for a moment, and chuckled under his breath. "I didn't choose silence for praise. I chose it so that kids like him wouldn't have to walk through shame just to be heard." He folded the article once, not out of disrespect, but like someone preserving something sacred in his pocket. Eli sat nearby, watching the young recruit try again. One step, then another. "You ever regret it?" Eli asked. Not yelling back, not taking the fight louder. Darius didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the kid who was wobbling again. He placed one steadying hand on the boy's back, then looked over his shoulder at Eli. "I used to think strength was about how loud you stood," he said. "But I learned the hard way. It's really about what makes you stay standing when everything else pushes you to fall." He turned back to the young man. "Let's go again." This time, no looking down. The kid straightened his back, focused, and took 3 full steps without the rails. No applause, no camera flashes, just breathing, just healing. And somewhere in the quiet, something shifted. Not in the courtroom, not in the headlines, but in the way a generation would carry themselves moving forward. Darius watched the boy finish the final step and whispered just loud enough for Eli to hear. "They kicked one man down, and ended up raising something bigger than any of us." Eli nodded too, moved to speak. As he walked out of the rehab center, he paused to look back one more time. Darius stood beside the young man, hand on his shoulder, eyes steady. Not a war hero, not a courtroom name, just a man who never stopped standing. That night, Eli published one final piece. No quotes, no opinion. Just a line under a quiet photo of Darius walking beside the boy. Justice didn't walk in shouting. It limped in, stood tall, and never bowed again. And this time the world listened. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that chooses not to shout. This story wasn't just about a courtroom. It was about dignity in the face of humiliation, about silent strength that speaks louder than fists, and about a man who walked through fire not for revenge but to pave a better road for the next to walk taller. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, true-feeling stories just like this. Every click, every share, every comment, it reminds us why we do this. Your support fuels our passion to keep telling the stories that others overlook, stories that challenge, inspire, and heal. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe memory is justice, and storytelling. It's how we remember together. Thanks for watching. And as always, keep your heart open and your story loud.